Great, and we're live.
Okay, we're live. That's great. Welcome, everyone. I've got Sanjay here, an avid poetry lover, aren't you, Sanjay? He's trying. Anyway, really welcome, everyone. Who have we got here so far?
Well, we've got 54 people
Have we?
already, yeah.
Well, that's much bigger than most poetry venues already, so that's fantastic. That's really good. That's really good.
We've got Kevin Delaney saying, hi, Maitreyabandhu, so pleased you're carrying the flag for us brave battalions of poetry lovers.
Well, they're not battalions, Kevin. They're the odd one or two in my experience. It's rare I come across a poetry lover, so congratulations. We're a rare species. But thank you for that vote of confidence. Who else have we got?
We've got Svadi here.
Oh, hello, Svadi. That's great. That's great.
We've got Veronica, Bodhinaga.
Bodhinaga, good.
Bodhinaga says, I'm hoping to become more refined.
Well, let's see. Let me know. Let me know at the end. I'm hoping to become more refined as well, Bodhinaga. Whilst we're on it.
We've got Adriana.
Oh, hello, Adriana. That's great. You're already refined, Adriana. I know you are. You've translated my poetry into Spanish, so you should have some sort of medal for that. It's a thankless task of translating.
We've got Mark.
Hi there, Mark.
From Stephanie, Sophie from Haringey.
Oh, good. Lots of locals. That's good.
Even Billy Edwards from Ireland. Richie.
Richie.
Or Richie.
Ah, Rick. That's probably anyway. Carry on. He's probably got your name wrong.
Elizabeth says she's been recently introduced to Sylvia Plath.
Oh yes, she's the person to be introduced to. I'm going to introduce you even more to Sylvia Plath.
David says thank you for the answer to the demon question.
Oh, good. Yes, I posted something on Slack today.
Yeah, we've got loads of people. Alex, Vicky, Maitreyabandhu says great to finally make a live poetry.
Hi there, Maitreyabandhu. Really nice to really nice. I see what to say. To see you. In my mind's eye, I can see you, but actually, I'm just looking to a plastic thing, but I can see you. Yeah, so that's lovely to have you, Maitreyabandhu, from Dublin. I mean, you don't really need to come to a poetry event. You've got poetry in your blood, Maitreyabandhu. The whole of Ireland is full of poetry.
Yeah, quite a few people from Dublin, actually.
I bet, yeah. Well, it's the only cultured place on the earth. No, I shouldn't say that. One of the rare places. Okay, look, we better start. Welcome, everyone, to PoetryEast. Welcome to you if you're on our summer retreat, which is going wonderfully well. I was teaching meditation this morning at 8 a.m. to nearly 400 people. It was wonderful. We've been having these evening events. This is a special event, as it were, in the sense of this isn't supposed to be good for you. The whole point of the arts is to enjoy them. And what you hope from that is that you're lifted and deepened and enriched without you noticing it. That it's not supposed to be good for you. So look, you can see how relaxed I am. I brought my cup of tea, which Sean gave me with the picture of the fox on. So make sure you've got a cup of tea for this or some suitable beverage. This is just a hangout place where I'm going to talk about a poem. I'm going to read one. I'm going to say what I think about it, what I think about the poet. You can just enjoy it. And hopefully at the end of it, Bodhinaga at least will feel refined. Trouble is with the word refined, it sounds like some sort of dreadful thing you do to sugar. What I hope is that you end up being enriched by the work, and the poems I've chosen are wonderful poems. Welcome to anyone tuning in on YouTube who are not on the retreat or not on the online summer retreat. You can still register for it and join. Just come along. You'll love it. And welcome everyone from our PoetryEast mailing list. We've got quite a long mailing list. I've just been in contact with I'm trying to get some other people going so I can do sort of live interviews with. So I've got a few things up my sleeve still. And welcome to anyone looking at this after the event. This is live at the moment. I am live. I was meeting someone in the cafe just now and they said, it's lovely to meet you live. But I've been live all the time. And you're live, aren't you? So. Okay, so let's plunge in. I'm not going to do lots of preparatory remarks about why we're doing this in the Buddhist center and so on, but if you don't know that by the end of it, I haven't communicated these poems well enough yet. So let's just plunge in. We're going to plunge in with the poetry of Derek Walcott. Look how thick that is. So you can imagine somebody bought this for me. It was on my shelf for about 4 years, with Derek sort of twinkling down at me from the spine. But you sort of think, oh, I don't know whether I can, I don't know. That's quite a commitment, that. Anyway, I've now read the whole thing, and I've read much of it many times. He's a wonderful, wonderful poet, Derek Walcott. He won the Nobel Prize for Poetry. He was born in 1930 and died only recently in 2017. Michael Schmidt, the editor of Carcanet, in his wonderful book on poetry, he thinks of Wolcott to be up there with Seamus Heaney and what's his name? the Australian poet.
I know what you mean.
Somebody online will know who is the great Australian poet at the moment who's just had his 80th birthday collected poems. That's the quiz question to start today with. It'll come back to me. Isn't that important?
Ted Hughes.
Nope. He's wrong. he's from up north in England. No, I can't remember his name. I knew it would go. Okay, so let's focus on Derek Walcott, not anybody else. So Derek Walcott was born in Castries in St. Lucia, in the Caribbean island in the West Indies. His family is of English, Dutch, and African descent. He writes about the English language, for instance. He said, it was never my second language. I never thought it was anybody else's language. It was for me to use. I've never felt pushed out by it. But yeah, he's from English, Dutch, African descent. Both of his grandparents were both white Europeans. Both of his grandfathers were white Europeans. Both of his grandmothers were African. Yeah. So he's got this incredible mix. He was also brought up as a Methodist in a mostly Catholic world, and his method and the feeling of that in really kind of is there in the poetry very much. And I won't say too much about that because I want to talk about it as we go. But yeah, he's the main reason I want to talk about Wolcott is because I think I'd like to see more people reading Derek Walcott. Not many people I know have read Derek Walcott. No surprise, not many people I know have read any contemporary poetry whatsoever. That's fine. You'll be fine without it. It's not like something you have to do. But it's interesting at the moment. You can understand at the moment with Black Lives Matter and with what's been happening in the world. There's been a real need to celebrate black writers, quite rightly, to celebrate their work, to see the achievement of black writers. So I've been a bit surprised that Derek Walcott's name hasn't come up in that. Are people reading him anymore is one of my questions in a way. And I've got a bit of a theory why his name perhaps isn't coming up as much as it should be, because he's really due to be celebrated very, very much. And you'll hear in a minute, as soon as you hear the poetry, there you go. I mean, my little theory about it, for what it's worth, it's only my theory, is one of the things about Derek Walcott's work is that he paints on a large canvas. His voice, his poetic voice is, well, he's often criticised for being florid. It's one of the standard criticisms. He's got quite a big voice. He quite enjoys. He's quite gestural. He'd be someone like Jackson Pollock. Big canvases, big colours. No, de Kooning. It'd be more like de Kooning. Big work. Big colours, big gestures. Some of that nowadays is a bit unpopular in some circles. And then the best of his work is long. The poem to really go to straight away is a great poem called The Schooner Flight, which is one of his major works. It's a long poem. It's not a massively long poem, but it's long. Omerous, which is his well-known book-length poem, is very long. There are longer poems, but it's long. But all of his important work that I've read are long poems, and not many people are reading poetry, and if they are, they're reading short lyrics. Wolcott isn't writing like Heaney, who wrote perfect kind of little short lyrics, 12-liners. Heaney's brilliant 12-liners. He writes long, kind of lush Caribbean poems full of surf and colour and sunlight and sensuality. Yeah? But they're long, so they don't get anthologized very easily. He's not someone you can sort of put a little lyric into. A famous poem of his is Love After Love, which is a short lyric. I think it's actually one of his weaker poems. To read him well, you need to read the long pieces. So that's another reason I think perhaps he's not as celebrated as he needs to be, as he should be, as he deserves to be. The other is that he carries with him now a sex scandal. It's a sex scandal that you can look up on Wikipedia. Sex scandals don't disappear now, and perhaps they shouldn't. But I haven't looked into the rights and wrongs of it. I don't feel it's my business. But yeah, he's brought with him a whole rumour, at the very least, of sex scandal. And I wonder whether that's meant that people are nervous now to turn to him. You know, in a bit of the same way as people are sometimes nervous to turn to Larkin, not because of sex scandals, but because of some of his apparent views, although you never quite know with Larkin what he means and what he's joking about. Anyway, so I thought we'd just try and look at one poem. I'm afraid because they're long, we probably won't have time. In fact, we won't have time to explore the whole poem. Hopefully, I don't know whether Ipali gave you the links for this, but there's a link for this. So I'll get Sandra to put the link in the chat, because this poem, The Light of the World, which I want to start on today, it's not one of his very long poems, but it goes over 4 pages, which nowadays is considered a long poem. It's not really, but it's too much for me to go into in one session and try and talk about 2 other poems. But Sanjay will post a link, and it's got the whole poem, and it's got Wolcott reading it, and his reading voice is wonderful. He reads it really beautifully. He reads it much better than I'll ever be able to read it. So what I'm hoping is that I can start you off with this poem. At least I can point you to it. I can then point you to other poems that I'd suggest you if you want to, you might think, actually, no, I'm not that committed. That's what you always think, isn't it? Am I that interested? That's a lot of interest I need to have there. So you might not be that interested, but I can show you some things that I'd start with, and that might whet your appetite. So I don't know how much we'll do of this, because I want to then move on to Plath, and I want to move on to Wilbur. But let's see how we go. And what I thought I'd do, because it's fairly long, not long, but fairly long, I'll read. It's in verse paragraphs. You can see it looks very chunky on the page. That's very much how Wolcott tends to look. Slightly forbidding. You can tell, can't you, just at a glance, that's not going to be a little lyric. That's not going to be a little moment in time. That's a bit of a commitment already, can't you? Just at a glance. Poems tell you a lot just at a glance. You can just think, okay, do I want to read that? Probably most of you, your answer will be no, won't it? Just because of the look of it. Okay, so let's plunge into it. The Light of the World, and it starts with an epigraph from Bob Marley. I'll try and slightly half sing this. Wolcott sings it beautifully in his reading. Kaya now, got to have Kaya now, got to have Kaya now, for the rain is falling. That's the epigraph from Bob Marley. I don't actually know the song, I'm afraid. So, The Light of the World. Marley was rocking on the transport stereo, and the beauty was humming the choruses quietly. I could see where the lights on the planes of her cheek streaked and defined them. If this was a portrait, you'd leave the highlights for last. These lights silkened her black skin. I'd have put in an earring, something simple, in good gold, for contrast, but she wore no jewelry. I imagined a powerful and sweet odor coming from her, as from a still panther, and the head was nothing else but heraldic. When she looked at me, then away from me politely, because any staring at strangers is impolite. It was like a statue, like a black Delacroix, liberty leading the people, the gently bulging whites of her eyes, the carved ebony mouth, the heft of the solid torso and a woman's, but gradually even that was going in the dusk, except the line of her profile and the high-lit cheek. And I thought, oh beauty, you are the light of the world. Yeah. So that's the first paragraph. Oh beauty, you are the light of the world. And remember, that's the title, The Light of the World. But you just look at those first two lines. Marley was rocking on the transport stereo, and the beauty was humming the choruses quietly. Yeah, beautiful. Even those first two lines, you captures beautiful sensuous music that you get in Wolcott. But lovely, starting with Marley, Bob Marley. So and rocking on Marley was rocking on the transport stereo. Now that word transport, to see how you'll find out it's a 16-seater transport. It's a little bus that's taking you from one place to another. But to see how transport is going to be a key word in this. It's a lot of the poem is about transport, and literally in the case is in a transport, but it's also to do with the transport of poetry, the transport of art. Yeah, and the beauty, and he doesn't capitalize beauty there, and the beauty was humming the choruses quietly. So at that point, the beauty is an abstraction. Do you see what I mean? You don't actually know that he means a woman he's looking at. The beauty was humming the choruses quietly. It could be a metaphor, couldn't it? Marley was rocking on the transport stereo, and the beauty was humming the choruses quietly. Humming the choruses quietly. Do you hear that? Humming the choruses quietly. The words sound like what they're saying, humming the choruses quietly. And the beauty would do that. But that could be the beauty of, this is on St. Lucia in the evening. It could be that an imaginative sense of the beauty around him humming the choruses quietly. Next line is, I could see where the lights on the planes of her cheek streaked and defined them. If this were a portrait, you'd leave the highlights for last. These lights silkened her black skin. I'd have put in an earring, something simple, in good gold for contrast, but she wore no jewelry. That's a beautiful bit of word painting, isn't it? I would have put an earring in good gold. Isn't that lovely? Good gold. That immediately you see her beautiful black skin, and it's lit by that good gold. And he creates that image and then dissolves it, but she wore no jewelry. And Wolcott himself trained as a painter. He's a twin, interesting. He's got a twin brother. His father was a civil servant, but a talented amateur painter. And Wolcott's, a lot of Wolcott's sort of feeling is very painterly. Even the way he writes is very painterly. To see how he's created this image of this beautiful black woman sitting in front of him, looking at her and the lights on her cheeks, and even saying, if it were a portrait, I'd put the highlights in last. That's what you do. Lovely word, good gold. Do you see how why has he put good there? Why not just gold? What is good that doing there? It's giving it something. It's giving it a kind of moral luster. That gold. It's making gold something more than merely an earring, but a mark or something. But she wore no jewelry. And then he said, I imagined a powerful and sweet odor coming from her, as from a still panther. Again, really sensuous, lovely. But he's imagining an odor, so there isn't one, as from a still panther, again with the lovely black fur of a panther. You'll start to, and you see as you go through this paragraph, it's evening. Yeah, and you can see that the color of her skin, the color of his skin, evening, being in St. Lucia is all melding together, and the beauty. is humming the choruses quietly. When she looked at me, then away from me politely. Isn't that lovely? When she looked at me, then away from me politely. Does it really quickly. And you know that moment where someone looks at you away from you politely, because any staring at strangers is impolite. So again, she's not wearing jewelry. She looks at him, but staring at strangers is impolite. The beautiful decorum of that, because any staring at strangers is impolite. It was like a statue, like a black Delacroix, liberty leading the people, the gently bulging whites of her eyes, the carved ebony mouth, the heft of the torso solid and a woman's, but gradually even that was going in the dusk, except the line of her profile and the high-lit cheek. And I thought, oh beauty, you are the light of the world. Yeah. Isn't that a tremendous piece of writing? That what he's taken you into this beauty, and there's all this yearning in the poem. The poem, in many ways, is a poem of yearning. You know how sometimes you see beautiful men and women, and you just want to worship them. They're just you feel that you could. I would assume you've had these moments in your own life. You feel a kind of idolatry, where when people are very beautiful, it's almost painful to look at them like they were an idol, And he communicates that really very, very beautifully, but with this great decorum, the good gold, wearing no jewelry, the unwillingness to be impolite. It's not crude at all. Gives her great majesty, like it describes her a bit like Delacroix, liberty leading the people, if you know that painting. But it's all gradually going in the dusk. Do you see that? Already in that first paragraph, he's got Marley was rocking on the transport stereo and the beauty was humming the choruses quietly. Then this lovely description of the beauty, which is a woman, then it becomes a portrait of a woman, then back to a woman, and then all these metaphors for the woman, and then even that beauty is dissolving in the dusk. And I thought, oh beauty, and it capitalized O, and O, and that beauty now is capitalized, so it's becoming both a universal matter and a person. Oh beauty, you are the light of the world. Okay, next paragraph. It was not the only time I would think of that phrase in the 16-seater transport that hummed between Gruzzelay and the market with its grit of charcoal and the litter of vegetables after Sunday sales and the roaring rum shops outside whose bright doors you saw drunk women on pavements, the saddest of all things, winding up their week, winding down their week. The market, as it closed on this Saturday night, remembered a childhood of wandering gas lanterns hung on poles at street corners, and the old roar of vendors and traffic when the lamplighter climbed, hooked the lantern on its pole, and moved on to another. And the children turned their faces to its moth, their eyes white as their nighties. The market itself was closed in its involved darkness, and the shadows quarrelled for bread in the shops, or quarrelled for the formal custom of quarrelling in the electric rum shops. Remembered the shadows. Yes, you see how big his canvas is, how lush it is. Yeah, it was not the only time I would think of that phrase, and that phrase comes back, and probably I won't ever get to it. But do my homework for you is to read the poem and then listen to Wolcott reading it. It was not the only time I would think of that phrase in the 16-seater transport that hummed between Gruzzelette and the market. So you see how that transport, it's got this perfect double meaning. It's a 16-seater transport, little transport, little minibus basically. But this word transport, I've not read critiques on this poem couldn't find any. But I think he's got Robert Frost in mind. I think he's got Robert Frost's fate. I mean, you might think, do say in the chat whether you agree and what you think he's got in mind. But if you know Robert Frost's famous poem Birches, again, it's a lot to do with poetry taking you, being a transport. In Frost's poem, it's about climbing up a birch tree until you almost leave the world and then bending back down to the earth. And Frost's poem is a fantastic metaphor for how poetry can take you out of the world, can be a transport, can transport you to new realms. And this is a fundamentally religious instinct. I don't mean religious necessarily in its theistic sense. I use the word religion now as another word for serious. It's an instinct that I want to leave the world. And one of the deeply moving things of this poem, which I must come to, even if I have to skip some, is this instinct. I want to leave the world and I want to be in it. I want to love the world and I want to leave it. I can't stand the world. The world's terrible and it's beautiful. Wolcott himself said, I have never separated the writing of poetry from prayer. I have grown up believing it is a vocation, a religious vocation. So this word transport and the possibility of poetry being prayer that will transport you. But you see how he's in this 16-seater transport. And what that does, it transports him back. Poetry is a time machine. It transports him back to his childhood in St. Lucia. He grew up there. And it's lovely, this beautiful picture of the lamplighter. He was born in 1930. So you're going back a long way. And he says, it's interesting, he said, where does he say? He says, the market, as it closed on this Saturday night, remembered a childhood. Which is lovely, isn't it? So the metaphor here is that the market remembered a childhood. He's not saying I remembered my childhood. So I like that kind of distancing there. The market remembered a childhood of wandering gas lanterns hung on poles at street corners and the old roar of vendors and traffic when the lamplighter climbed, hooked the lantern on its pole and moved on to another. And the children turned their faces to its moth, their eyes as white as their nighties. That's fabulous, isn't it? That's fabulous. Their eyes as white as their nighties. Do you see what I mean? That the children turn their faces to its moth, their eyes as white as their nighties. The market itself was closed in its involved darkness. Yeah, that's lovely. And the shadows quarrelled for bread in the shops, or quarrelled for the formal custom of quarrelling in the electric rum shops. I remember the shadows. Yeah, so many things going on there. I can't sort of unpack them all. I haven't got time, but there's so many things going on there. Partly it's about he's thinking about his childhood. So Castries, where he was born. Sandra, why are you looking into your phone so much? I can't help worrying that you're bored. You're supposed to attend to it.
No, I'm trying.
I'm sure he's doing something very.
It's a connection.
It's a fearful. Oh, sorry. Okay. It's a fearful thing when people they're either looking at the poem or they're just texting their girlfriend. Anyway, any teacher has this issue. Anyway, well, I'll draw into it. To see how, when he grew up in St. Lucia, Castries, where he came from, burnt down twice in his childhood. So it's interesting that he remembers the lamplighter, and I remembered the shadows and the electric rum shops, and this feeling for his people, for those people. There's slavery in the background of this, I think. There's race. There's all sorts of things. There's so much in this poem. What I'm going to do, I think, is, because I haven't got much longer for this poem, and do really listen to him read more. For those of you interested in form, it's written, as a lot of his poetry is written, in quite loose iambic pentameter. He often stretches the pentameter to be a hexameter. It's got a big line feeling to it, a pentameter-like feeling. He bends that quite a lot, I think, but very beautifully. I want to jump a paragraph because it's a shame, but really one just should never do this with a poem, because the poem's a whole, and you should never try and take it apart and give you just a bit of it. But time, I'm afraid, really this wants me to do a whole evening on this poem. It really deserves it as well. I mean, I think it's a really good place to start with Wolcott. I was talking to Maitreyabandhu about it, a good friend of mine, and he was saying, I read it, I loved it. I don't know why I loved it. I just thought this was a marvelous poem, but I didn't know why. And I said, nor did I, but I had exactly that same feeling, that this is wonderful. And I think it needs a lot of turning over to explicate that. But let me just jump a paragraph forward, and we probably better finish on this poem with that, and I'll point you to some other poems. So paragraph on, which is a terrible thing to do, but do listen to him read it. An old woman with a straw hat over her headkerchief hobbled towards us with a basket. Somewhere, some distance off, was a heavier basket that she couldn't carry. She was in a panic. She said to the driver, "Paquisez-moi à terre," which is, in her patois, "Don't leave me stranded," which is, in her history and that of her people, "Don't leave me on earth." Or, by a shift of stress, "Don't leave me the earth for inheritance." Paquisez-moi à terre, heavenly transport, don't leave me on earth. I've had enough of it. The bus filled in the dark with heavy shadows that would not be left on earth. No, that would be left on the earth. I would have to make out. Abandonment was something they had grown used to. I mean, I find that, just that paragraph puts hairs on I can feel my hairs on my head sticking up, just that paragraph. An old woman with a straw hat over her handkerchief hobbled towards us with a basket. Somewhere, some distance off, was a heavier basket she couldn't carry. You see it, don't you? It's like a film. You see that. You've seen that somehow. I've never seen that in my life. One of the wonderful things that poetry can give us, if we take it seriously in this right way, and you mustn't take it too seriously in the wrong way, in that awful, pretentious way, but what it can do is it makes your imagination leap across time and space. Suddenly you're in St. Lucia watching an old black woman who's got a basket that she's trying to get into a 16-seater dark bus, one of those old jalopy kind of knackered things, and you just had actually a paragraph of all of that, which I haven't been able to read. And then she's got another basket. You know that panic. Don't leave me. Don't go off with me now, because I've got to go back and get that basket. And then that one sentence, she was in a panic. So beautifully evoked in only 3 lines. She was in 4 lines. She was in a panic. She said to the driver, and I don't know whether I've got this pronunciation right, I'm terrible at this sort of thing, "Paquisez-moi à terre," which in her patois is "don't leave me stranded." Do you see, that's poetry. Don't leave me stranded. Now, on one level, that's simply don't drive off without me. That's in the world that we live in. Don't drive off without me. But don't leave me stranded. Don't you sometimes feel that? And this is in a poem, "Don't leave me stranded," which in her patois is "don't leave me stranded," which is in her history and that of her people. So again, it's evoking the whole of that, her people. Yeah. Beautifully, very delicately put in, no overemphasis. Her people, don't leave me on earth. I find that so moving, don't leave me on earth. Or, by a shift of stress, don't leave me the earth for an inheritance. Paquisez-moi à terre, heavenly transport, don't leave me on earth. I've had enough of it. Isn't that's, I mean, this isn't even as good as the poem gets, but it's, for me, one of the highlights of the poem. Don't leave me on earth. I've had enough of it. Do you see how poetry's attempt to say, don't leave me on earth, I've had enough of it. I want to leave earth. Please don't leave me stranded. It's as if she's saying that to the poet, saying it to the bus driver on a transport. She wants heavenly transport. Yeah? Don't leave me on earth. I've had enough of it. Haven't you felt like that? Golly, I felt like that at times. Don't leave me on earth. I've had enough of it. And then straight after, the bus filled in the dark with heavy shadows. But what on earth is a heavy shadow? And yet it's a small transport. It's dusk. The electric rum shops in memory of his childhood, shadows from his childhood, shadows perhaps from the burning down of his village, shadows from slavery, shadows from just the pain of an old woman trying to get a basket, a poor old woman trying to get a basket to get to the next village. They're heavy shadows, aren't they? The bus filled in the dark with heavy shadows that would not be left on earth. No, that would be left on the earth, and would have to make out. Heavy shadows that would not be left on earth. No, that would be left on the earth, yeah? And would have to make out. Abandonment was something they had grown used to. So do you see how that's referring back to slavery? It's referring back to so many things that I don't have any experience of and much knowledge of. But I immediately see that woman getting onto the bus. And I don't know about you, but I feel for her. I know that feeling of, oh, don't go. I've got to get out again. And when you're older, as you get older, I haven't got there yet, but it was only just around the corner, getting back to pick up another heavy basket, that's quite a job. Don't leave me stranded, because if I go back and you drive off, you're feeling for her. And then abandonment was something they had grown used to, her people and the history of her people. What's fantastic, you then have the white space of the new paragraph. And then, shockingly, he then said, and I had abandoned them. Yeah, and I had abandoned them. The sentence goes on, but I'm going to finish us there. But I had abandoned them. So he troubles that thought. A lesser poet would have gone down the line of abandonment and they, and left him, the poet, or the poet to be, him or her to be, the hero of the poem. But he then says, and I had abandoned them. Yeah, I had abandoned them. So look, I'd love to read the rest of the poem. I've already missed out a paragraph, which is an outrageous thing to do. So you might want to, run out and buy this yet. But do listen to, go tonight, get yourself, light a candle tonight after our ritual tonight, light a candle and just listen to Derek Walcott read it. He reads it beautifully with perfect, he's a beautiful reader actually. And then run out and look at the Schooner Flight, look at The Divided Child, a wonderful long poem, autobiographic poem. And the Arkansas Testament is another poem I'd really, really recommend. I mean, that's what I did. I just looked at those and then I thought, actually, I'm just going to read it from cover to cover. It's that good. So that's just a bit of a starter on the wonderful poetry of Derek Walcott. Yeah. But I've called this Poetry in Crisis, and you can see Derek Walcott's crisis. You can start to see that because you've got this mixed descent, African and white European. You've got Dutch, English. You've got Methodism. You've got this yearning for beauty and the trouble that can get you into. But also, we human beings, we yearn for beauty. So there's a whole crisis unfolding in that poem, and you'll see that it just deepens and deepens. It doesn't put a foot wrong, that poem. Yeah. It'll stay with us for a long, long time. But let's turn to the poetry of Sylvia Plath. So she was born in 1932 and died tragically, as we all know, in 1963 of suicide. So what I thought I'd do again is I'll just read the poem. This poem is her first. This is a poem that she really first discovered her voice, as it were. I'm reading it actually in this wonderful book by Helen Vendler, she's a poetry critic. I mean, I found others as well now that I really admire, but Helen Wendler is the star of poetry critique. Her reading the poems, you know, she's just incredible. They're just incredible. This is a book called Coming of Age as a Poet, where she looks at the first major poem by Milton, Keats, Eliot, and Plath. So I'll read it, and then I'll see if I can unpack it a bit. Once again, this is much shorter, and I can read the whole lyric. It's a short lyric poem. So I can read it, and I'll try and unpack it. Again, there's an awful lot to say about it. She's, in a way, she's quite a good comparison with Wolcott, because Wolcott is expansive. It's full of, as I said, Caribbean surf. It's that light. It's not an English indirection and rectitude. He wants to speak. He wants to sing. He wants to pray. Plath, an American poet, a very, very different voice. And one of her great geniuses is concision. And this is the first poem often that many people say that she found her voice. So let's hear it, her voice. The Colossus. I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your lips. It's worse than a barnyard. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead, or some god or other. 30 years now I have laboured to dredge the silt from your throat. I am none the wiser. Scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of Lysol, I crawl like an ant in mourning over the weedy acres of your brow to mend the immense skull plates and clear the bald white tumuli of your eyes. A blue sky out of the Oresteia arches above us. Oh, Father, all by yourself, you are as pithy and historical as the Roman Forum. I open my lunch on a hill of black cypresses. Your fluted bones and acanthine hair are littered in their old anarchy to the horizon line. It would take more than a lightning stroke to create such a ruin. Nights I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear out of the wind, counting the red stars and those of plum colour. The sun rises under the pillar of your tongue. My hours are married to shadow. No longer do I listen for the scrape of the keel on the blank stones of the landing. Yeah. The Colossus. So do you see that voice? What a different voice. Yeah? What poetry is a voice. Auden famously says, all I have is a voice. Yeah, that's what, and he said that poetry is memorable speech. Best short definition you can get. Shortest 2-word definition of poetry, memorable speech. Yeah? All I have is a voice. And to hear that different voice, I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. If you hear Plath read, there are recordings of Plath reading, she's fairly terrifying. She's got this terribly posh, Americanized accent that's even more scary than the poems. Yeah? I shall never get you put together entirely. I shall never get you put together entirely. If you met somebody who said, I shall never get you put together entirely, you're immediately a bit like, whoa, it's slightly aggressive. It's witty in a mordant, mocking sort of way, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard, which is very funny, actually. It's worse than a barnyard. Do you see that's an early example of a wonderful concision. It's worse than a barnyard. All those noises, yeah. But all those hard words, mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. Yeah. So that's how the poem starts. I shall never get you put together entirely. So the Colossus, yeah, the Colossus. And did you hear that? I mean, I find it so soothing. The fulcrum of the poem is those words, "O Father." Right in the middle of the poem, she says, "O Father, all by yourself, you are as pithy and historical as the Roman Forum." That's the kind of emotional fulcrum of the whole poem. The poem, it's almost in the dead center of the poem, interesting. The poem's like an arch which builds to that emotional moment and moves and resolves from that. So this is a poem about a father, "O Father," but you don't get any of that again originally. You get the Colossus. So what she's imagining is this huge Colossus. A bit. I wonder whether she's looking at Henry Moore. You know how Henry Moore gets a figure and sort of takes a leg off and the arm off and makes a great big sculpture. But what she's created is this huge, colossal sculpture of her father. And it seems to be near a sea with cypresses and a blue sky and this huge Colossus. And I shall never get you. I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. So she's got this terrifying image of her father as being this massive Colossus that she's trying to piece and glue and properly put together again, some smashed ruin that she's trying to put together again. You know, sort of, what's that about? So, of course, that makes you want to look at her father, Otto Plath. He died a week and a half after Plath's 8th birthday. Yeah. His story is really deeply tragic, as her story becomes. Her father was an entomologist, studied insects, and wrote a book about bumblebees. So he's a scientist. A friend of his died of lung cancer, and not long after Plath's father died of lung cancer, Otto Plath became ill, and he self-diagnosed himself as having lung cancer. Actually, he had late onset diabetes, but he refused any treatment for 4 years. He thought he had lung cancer, did nothing about it, wouldn't be diagnosed. He just had late onset diabetes, very easy to treat. You just treat it with diet, probably. He was convinced he had lung cancer, for 4 years, refused any medical treatment, eventually had his leg amputated because of diabetic gangrene, and then died, just after, a week and a half after Plath's 8th birthday. Do you see what are you to make of that? Your father is a scientist, and daughters' relationship with their father is very, very important, often very, very close relationship. And he's basically weirdly committed suicide. He's just got this idea that he's got lung cancer. He hasn't got lung cancer. He's just got laid on. He won't have any treatment, gradually gets iller and iller because it's not being treated, has gangrene of the leg, which is horribly painful, has to have his leg amputated and dies. Plath herself said that she first tried to commit suicide herself when she was 10. Her life and her poetry has been overshadowed by her tragic suicide and by, the assumption that it was caused by her husband, Ted Hughes. Actually, Plath's mother, and we'll hear more from Plath's mother later on, was really clear quite soon after the Plath suicide. Plath's mother said it was always going to happen. It's probably now Sylvia Plath would probably be thought of having bipolar disease or something like that, bipolar depression. And it's quite possible now, looking back, perhaps one should never diagnose people from the grave, that probably her father was very depressed or something like that. But you can imagine, what can you do with that? So what she's done with that is that she's made him into this huge statue that she's trying to make sense of. I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. What a terrifying and wonderful way of saying, I can't make sense of you. I can't make sense of you. I'll never get you to put together entirely. She has to sort of resort to this terrible wit. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead, or some god or other. Now, one of the formal things in the poem that you won't notice, and frankly I didn't notice, is how many of the lines have a dying fall, as you might call it, a rather Shakespearean way. They've got a weak line ending. I shall never put you together entirely. Do you see how I shall never put you together entirely? It's got this sort of at the end. Pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips is the only word that isn't a weak ending. It's worse than a barnyard. Strong ending. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, another weak-ended, mouthpiece of the dead, or some god or other. A lesser poet would have written, or some god, would have felt stronger, or some god or other. So you've got these funny falling off lines, and they come again and again through the poem. This musical falling off at the end of each line, a slightly depressive falling off. And then you've got this funny antiphonal thing going on. I, you, keeps going on through the poem. If you listen to it carefully, I, you, I, you, I, you, I, you. I will never get you, I will never get you put together entirely. So that you then, perhaps you consider, you see how that, in the form of the poem, is saying, I'm trying to work this out. Me, I, you, and this falling off of the words. So, and then I just want to point a few more things out, and then we better move to the next poem. But there's so much to say about this poem. 30 years now I have laboured to dredge the silt from your throat. Full stop. I am none the wiser. Isn't that terribly tragic? It's funny. You see, it's mordantly fun. She's using humour as a kind of protection. It is funny and self-protective and aggressive and also sort of tragic. I am none the wiser. It's sort of school-marmy and tragic at the same time. She's trying to find strategies to deal with this. I've tried to understand what happened for 30 years. In a letter she wrote, she's got this terrifying imagination. She imagines digging her father up. She went to his grave and was horrified about the graveyard and imagines digging him up and how much of him would be left. But she's just trying to make sense of it. Probably now, the one theory is now that the therapy she had at the time made things worse. She also had ECT, electroconvulsive therapy for her depression. That her life is it's a car crash, and she's trying to make the best of it. She's trying to do what she can. I am none the wiser. Actually, that's funny, tragic, angry, all at the same time. Only a wonderful poet could pull that off. I am none the wiser. Nothing like that. It's not a big canvas. I am none the wiser. But look at this next part. It's even better. Scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of Lysol, I crawl like an ant in mourning over the weedy acres of your brow. And it carries on. But scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of Lysol, that's a trade name for an American glue. So this picture of this massive colossus that's her father turned into this dead stone thing that she's trying to get to speak, isn't she? Because earlier on she's saying, mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. I'm trying to dredge the silt from your throat, she says in the next stanza. I'm trying to tell me what went on. I'm none the wiser. Then she's scaling little ladders with glue. She's trying to stick this sculpture together again to make sense of him. I crawl like an ant in mourning. That's a piece of work. You could not come up with that. You know, people sometimes think, oh, I could write that. You could not write that. I could not write that. I wish I could. I mean, I'm glad that I didn't have the life that made me have to write that. But you see the concision of that. It represents interminable labor, doesn't it? I crawl like an ant in mourning. Ants are working all the time. So it's a terrible picture of interminable labor. It's also a picture of incredible reduction of size. She's created, her father is now this, not a human anymore, this massive colossus, and she's an ant crawling across it. Incredible diminution of size. Therefore, helplessness is in that line. A present sense acknowledgement of this endless work that's needed. She's become tiny, and there's endless work that's needed. A grief portrayed as an endless, having to sort of stick it together, an ant in mourning with little pots of glue, trying to stick this huge edifice together. To see all of that is communicated by that one very short line, I crawl like an ant in mourning. Of course, ants are black. So, you know, it's working. That line, it's only 7 words, is working, is saying so many different things at the same time. It's a brilliant example of poetic concision. But then, so she has that wonderful, over the weedy acres of your brow to mend the immense skull plates and clear the bald white tumuli of your eyes. So that the eyes have become like huge mountains that this little ant is scurrying over, trying to get back to piece together. And then she crosses the white space of the stanza. A blue sky out of the Oresteia arches above us. Now that's actually a bit more positive for her. She's turning it into, instead of being, up to now it's this dreadful labor, an ant in mourning, trying to glue together. She's suddenly found a way of it. Actually, it's more like a Greek tragedy, she's saying. And then she says, "O Father," which I find like unbearably moving. After all that anger and aggression and irony and concision, she says, "O Father," which is very old-fashioned poetic. "O Father, all by yourself, you are as pithy and historical as the Roman Forum." What she's saying is like the Roman Forum, there is levels and levels to you that I can never plumb. Yeah? "O Father, all by yourself, you're as pithy and historical as the Roman Forum." There's love in that line. She's allowing herself to love her father, because her father, whatever that relation, and she talks about her life pre-8 as sort of sealed off for her from ever, the life she had with her parents before then. She finds a way of being able to contact that for a moment, her love for her father. And then she says, "I opened my lunch on a hill of black cypresses. Your fluted bones and acanthine hair littered in their old anarchy to the horizon line." Beautiful. But you see how fluted bones and acanthine hair, suddenly this Colossus has gone a long way from mule bray and pink grunt, hasn't it? It's gone a long way from that. Suddenly there's love is allowed to come in, real love for her father, and a coming to terms. And then she says, "Nights I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear." It's another perfect piece of concision. It tells you that this work is something she's going to do day and night. She sleeps there. She's always working on this Colossus. There's no shelter. She has to shelter in the cornucopia of her ear and out of the wind because there's no shelter. But also she must be trying to say, I want my father to be able to hear me. Yeah, I want him to be able to hear me. But then she says, counting the red stars and those of plum color. That was the line that really gripped me when I first read this poem. I just thought, oh, that's wonderful. Nobody but Sylvia Plath could write that line. and counting the red stars and those of plum colour, again that falling off sound, those of plum colour. So that's, she's finding an aesthetic moment in all that horrible labour of trying to piece together her father and this awful tragic end of the blank stones, because we've had blank stones all the way through, and she'll never hear her father is watching. He'll never come back at the end of the poem. So let me just read it again. There's much more I wanted to say, but we don't have time. But this poem combines wit, tragedy, anger, and love all into one short lyric poem. Yeah, I'll just read it one more time, and then we'll go on to our final poem. There's so much to say about. Do you see how poetry is like? It's just packed. If you enter into it, you can just keep going in deeper and deeper into the poem. I've just scratched the surface. The Colossus. I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead, or of some god or other. 30 years now I have laboured to dredge the silt from your throat. I am none the wiser. Scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of lyso, I crawl like an ant in mourning over the weedy acres of your brow to mend the immense skull plates and clear the bold white tumuli of your eyes. A blue sky out of the Oresteia arches above us. Oh, Father, all by yourself, you're as pithy and historical as the Roman Forum. I opened my lunch on a hill of black cypresses. Your fluted bones and acanthine hair are littered in their old anarchy to the horizon line. It would take more than a lightning stroke to create such a ruin. Nights, I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear, out of the wind, counting the red stars and those of plum colour. The sun rises under the pillar of your tongue. My hours are married to shadow. No longer do I listen for the scrape of the keel on the blank stones of the landing. No longer do I listen for the scrape of the keel on the blank stones of the landing. So she's imagining her father coming back in a boat, like he would in the Oresteia, she's imagining the sails, the white sail being seen against the blue and the scrape of the keel of her father comes back. But she's saying, no longer do I listen for the scrape of the keel on the blank stones of the landing. To see that tragic blank stones, because that's what she's been trying to make sense of, this blank stones. Yeah? And eventually, I'm afraid those blank stones would be too much for her and would crush her. Yeah? But she's left poems that are tragically, painfully alive. So we've got time for one more poem. But you see, that's poetry in crisis. You can see that Plath is trying to make something of it. What poets like Plath are trying to do is make something of her life, the tragedy of her life. And she's made things. She's made a Colossus actually in that poem. And she's trying to. She's a very, very ambitious poet. And somebody I met knew somebody who knew her and was saying both her and Hughes, both of them, I can't remember, he was saying that both of them were incredibly ambitious. She wants to create a Colossus of that in that poem. Good for her, and she's succeeded. You won't get rid of it. It's going to last longer than a statue. So let's finally come to one of my favourite poems, the American poet Richard Wilbur, died in 2017. Was born in 1921. So he was in his 90s when he died. He first became famous as a war poet. He served in the infantry in the Second World War. He served in Anzio and Monte Cassino. Like anyone who's encountered real horrors, he's very, very reticent in his poetry about talking about it. Hardly ever mentions it. There's some poems he talks about it. He's very, very cautious of it. Real horrors tend to make some of us at least get tongue-tied, not expressive. I'm always a bit suspicious of people who can talk too easily about horrors. I don't know about you, and perhaps it's my English lower middle class conditioning, but painful things I want to, very painful things I can't bear to talk about. It takes me a while to talk about. And he follows in that. He was an Episcopalian, quite a religious man. One critic thinks that about 2/3 of his work has got conspicuous Christian elements to it. He seems to be weirdly unfashionable. His poetry is often considered too beautiful. It would be a lovely criticism to have to deal with, and sometimes I think perhaps it is, but I think it's too easy a criticism to make of him. In his interview in his Paris Review interview, Paris Review? What is it? I can't remember now. Anyway, a very famous series of interviews. He said, I feel that the ultimate character of things is comely and good. He said, he's basically saying, I think if you go deep enough, things are good, not bad. He's an opposite of Plath in that way. And he says, look, it might be my conditioning, and it might be, and I can see how you might think about that, but that is my experience, that I think if you go deep enough into life, I see something good. And that must be something that's also supported by his faith. But let's plunge into this poem, wonderful poem, Cottage Street, 1953. I think this is a major poem by a major poet who, again, like Wolcott, deserves to be much better known. One of the issues with Richard Wilbur, he writes wonderful comic poetry. He's written 3 collections of poems for children with his own illustrations in them. Rather really lovely illustrations. And they're very funny, comic poems for children. I tried to buy some for the girls, but they're not in print as individual collections anymore. It's a shame, they're wonderful poems for children, very funny. He also writes hymns, which couldn't be more out of fashion now. He also, writes translation, which is also unfashionable. Anyway, never mind. Cottage Street, 1953. Framed in her phoenix fire screen, Edna Ward bends to the tray of Canton, pouring tea for frightened Mrs. Plath. Then, turning towards the pale, slumped daughter and my wife and me, asks if we would prefer it weak or strong. Will we have milk or lemon? She inquires. The visit seems already strained and long. Each in his turn, we tell her our desires. It is my office to exemplify the published poet in his happiness, thus cheering Sylvia, who has wished to die. But half ashamed and impotent to bless, I am a stupid lifeguard who has found, swept to the shallows by the tide, a girl who, far from the shore, has been immensely drowned and stares through water now with eyes of pearl. How large is her refusal, and how slight the genteel chat whereby we recommend life of a summer afternoon, despite the brewing dusk, which hints that it must end. And Edna Ward shall die in 15 years after her 88 summers of such grace and courage as permit no tears, the thin hand reaching out, the last word, love, outliving Sylvia, who, condemned to live, shall study for a decade, as she must, to state at last her brilliant negative in poems, free and helpless and unjust. Yeah. Fabulous. In its own way, terrifying poem. And to see the setup is so remarkable. It's only when you get to Mrs. Plath, so that's Sylvia Plath's mother that we've already mentioned. So Edna Ward is Richard Wilbur's mother-in-law. And it's this wonderful kind of setup of this terribly genteel thing that Edna Ward is obviously, and what she's done is invite Mrs. Plath and her daughter Sylvia to meet Richard Wilbur. And the idea is to show Sylvia you can be a poet and be happy. Yeah, it's doable. Wilbur's poetry, he wrote poems in the Second World War. And there's a lovely story of him. He just wrote them. He said he wrote them just to sort of survive it. Wrote these beautiful rhyme. Nearly all of his work is in strict rhyme and meter. And he showed it to his friend, and his friend went off and read them, came back and embraced them and said, "You're a poet." And his poetry sort of was established almost right from the word go. It's like, and pretty much continued. He's won every prize in going apart from the Nobel. There's so many depths to this poem. So Edna Ward bends to the tray of Canton pouring tea. It's sweet and tragic. It's a poem about what on earth do you do? And people are trying their best and probably not, wow, but what do you do for frightened Mrs. Plath? That's so strong because by this time, Plath had tried to commit suicide again in her early 20s. For frightened Mrs. Plath, then turning towards the pale, slumped daughter and my wife and me, asked if we'd prefer it weak or strong. "Will we have milk or lemon?" she inquired. I remember that a bit. I mean, people don't do that anymore. They don't have tea in that afternoon tea way. And then the visit seems already strained and long. Each in his turn, we tell her our desires. Do you want milk? It's a terribly thin setup. And the only thing that's disturbed it is frightened Mrs. Plath. Yeah? And then it is my office to exemplify the published poet in his happiness, thus cheering Sylvia, who has wished to die. But half ashamed and impotent to bless, I'm a stupid lifeguard who has found, swept to his shallows by the tide, a girl who, far from shore, has been immensely drowned and stares through water now with eyes of pearl. Terribly, immensely drowned. But also this ripple of concern about his own work, I am a stupid lifeguard who has found swept to his shallows. There's an undertow of concern about his own work there. That am I a shallow poet? Is my work just the sort of thing of tea time? It's also written in. Did you notice it's written in perfect rhyme? A B rhyming, which is ferociously difficult to do actually. Edna Ward to Ward, T me, strong, long, inquires, desires. Yeah, that's how the rhyme. Exemplify, die, happiness, bless. And it's all strictly in pentameter and strictly in that rhyming scheme. He takes no liberties with it. He rarely does actually. He wants the toughness of form to force him to say something. Yeah. People tend to think that form is old-fashioned. Another reason why he's perhaps not read as much is because there's this ridiculous assumption still as that form is kind of old-fashioned, possibly right-wing, possibly conservative, backward-looking, moribund. That what we want to do is liberate ourselves to free verse and just say what's in my heart. It's a complete misunderstanding of form. What form does is it stops you saying what you want to say. It pushes you. It forces you to say it better and to say it beautifully and to come up with things that you couldn't think of. It actually, if you get the right form, and Wilbur is a great formalist in the best sense, if you get the right form, it liberates you to speak and to say things that you couldn't say in your voice. Plath actually employs a lot of form in her poetry, but it's very disguised. Those falling off lines, that antiphonal IU structure, that arch leading to O Father being the center of the poem. But she's learned how to hide it. Wilbur favors this sort of the great tradition of rhyming scheme with pentameter, but he does it wonderfully. Interestingly, when he writes poetry, Wilbur used to say that he used to write it in pencil, and he wouldn't type it up until he was really, so he'd just rub it out again and again. There's pictures of him in the garden with a pencil and a bit of paper, writing a line, rubbing it out, writing a line, until he was happy with it. And he'd only type it up when he was happy with it, because he said, when you type things up, they can look better than they are. Unless they look good in pencil, they're not going to be that good. So don't type it. I thought it was brilliant. I should do that, but I don't. But of course, this poem, how large is her refusal, and how slight and genteel, and how slight the genteel chat whereby we recommend line break life, comma. That's actually a wonderful, recommend is to do with the rhyme, but slight, despite, recommend, end. You see, rhyme in poetry is also about the content. That recommend is rhymed tragically with end. Yeah? So I am the stupid life girl. Oh, we've done that, sorry. How large is her refusal, and how slight the genteel chat whereby we recommend, what do we recommend? Line break, new line, life, comma. And do you see how life, we recommend life. Do you see how different, that's what poetry does. In prose, you'd have to say, we recommend life on the same line. But poetry can do, we recommend life. And it makes it fall, and then with a comma afterwards, which is not the sort of thing that Wilbur will do, because you have to, you're either very clever to do that, or you're very weak, because you don't want 1 foot of the pentameter in like that. You don't want life like that, especially with a comma after it. But it makes it fall badly. We recommend, in his head rather hopelessly, life of a summer afternoon, rather beautiful, despite the brewing dusk. Brewing is a wonderful word there, because it's relating back to the tea. But despite the brewing dusk, which hints that it may end. Hints is the sort of thing you do in tea, these sort of genteel chats. You're trying to hint something. Wouldn't it be better if you didn't commit suicide again? How useless that is, and he knows that. And then this lovely, and Edna Ward shall die in 15 years. It takes you all the way 15 years later to the death. So this poem, tiny, so it fits in 1 page. Tiny poem takes you all the way 15 years later than the 1953 to the death of his mother-in-law, whose last word is love in italics. She might be genteel and slightly comic figure. Do you want milk or lemon? She's trying her best, and it's too easy to mock that. It's too easy to mock people who try their best and try to help. What was she supposed to do? Sit her down and say, come on now, what's happening with your suicide attempt? Lots of people are like Edna Ward, really trying their best with the language and the world that they've come from. It's too easy to blame them. It's too easy to mock them. And she's lived a life of such courage, such grace and courage as permits no tears, presumably from the author and from his wife. Actually, Wilbur's relationship with his wife is very beautiful. He's written beautiful poems about his wife. They were very close. Outliving Sylvia, who, condemned to live, shall study for a decade as she must, to state at last her brilliant negative. That's a fantastic, that's a Plath-like concision to describe Plath's poetry, her brilliant negative. It's a brilliant conjunction there, her brilliant negative. That's a superb piece of concision from Wilbur, doing very much what the sort of thing Plath might do. In poems, free, they are, free verse. She uses free verse a lot, but they're also free in the sense of she's trying to free, you can see in the poem that we've explored in the Colossus, she's trying to free her tongue. She's trying to free herself to speak. And even of her father, she says something about the sun rising under the column of your tongue. So in poems, free and helpless. That's a wonderful word to describe Plath's poem. The helplessness of her life. She says she first tried to commit suicide when she was 10. The helpless pain of her life, the sense that her mother frightened for her daughter right from this terrible death of her father, and writing to Hughes saying, really, I always feared it would happen, exonerating Hughes. Helpless, that's true. And then this incredible last word, and unjust. Yeah, and unjust. Now, whether you agree with him, that's he's saying it's not quite right. It's not like that. It's unjust. It's unjust to you. It's unjust to life. It's unjust. Yeah. The poem to corkscrews on that word. It comes to this frightening conclusion of unjust. Very, very. When you see that the drama of the poem is gone from this chintzy, well-meaning afternoon tea with lemon and weak or strong, frightened Mrs. Plath, all the way to that brilliant negative, to free and helpless and unjust. Yeah. Fantastic, rather terrifying poem. And you might disagree with his estimation, but I can see what he means. And I can also see what she means. They make these two poems a wonderful conversation about poetry in crisis. They make a wonderful conversation about poetry in crisis. So let's read this poem again. Yeah? I don't do these poems enough justice. I think we can send out links. You've sent out links for all the poems. So do read the poems again. Listen tonight if you can. Light some candles. Just lie down and listen to Wolcott reading The Light of the World. Listen to it again and again. I tried to find a recording of Plath reading Colossus. I couldn't find one. But you can hear Plath reading Daddy, which is even more terrifying. Somebody suggested, why didn't you read Daddy, which is a wonderful, terrifying poem, but you can hear her read it. I couldn't find a recording of Wilbur reading Colossus Street, but there are recordings, obviously, of him reading his poems. So you can just pop one on and just enjoy it, just listen to it. Beautiful stuff. But we've shared the links for all the poems, so you can sort of follow them up in your own way. So yeah, Cottage Street, 1953. Framed in her phoenix, I can never get that word right, phoenix, isn't it? Framed in her phoenix fire screen, Edna Ward bends to the tray of Canton, pouring tea for frightened Mrs. Plath. Then turning towards the pale, slumped daughter and my wife and me, asks if we would prefer it weak or strong. Will we have milk or lemon? She inquires. The visit seems already strained and long. Each in his turn, we tell her our desires. It is in my office to exemplify the published poet in his happiness, thus cheering Sylvia, who has wished to die, but half ashamed and impotent to bless. I'm a stupid lifeguard who was found swept to his shallows by the tide, a girl who, far from shore, has been immensely drowned and stares through water now with eyes of pearl. How large is her refusal, and how slight the genteel chat whereby we recommend life of a summer afternoon, despite the brewing dusk, which hints that it may end. And Edna Ward shall die in 15 years, after 80 summers of such grace and courage as permit no tears, the thin hand reaching out, the last word, love. Outliving Sylvia, who, condemned to live, shall study for a decade as she must, to study, to state at last her brilliant negative in poems free and helpless and unjust. Good. So I hope you found those poems as moving and as rich as I do. And I hope you get a sense of what poetry is. That poetry is like a hand reaching across time to you. It's like a mind reaching you. It's like a word. It's a voice speaking to you. And it can speak to you from St. Lucia. And it can tell you what it's like to be in a 16-seater transport and to fall in love. You know, you've had those moments on a bus where you look at someone, you sort of fall in love with them. It can speak to you of that. It can speak to you of her people, and don't leave me stranded. Don't leave me on earth. I've had enough of it. It can speak to you about that and can make you feel for that. It can make you feel for a brilliantly intelligent American woman whose father, strangely, in the most disturbing conditions, commits suicide, and you've got to make something of your life on the basis of that colossal wreck, and you're like an ant in mourning over that colossal wreck of your father that's shadowed your life. I am married to shadow, she says, and it can take you to a genteel chat with lemon and weak or strong tea with Edna Ward, the mother-in-law of Richard Wilbur, talking to Sylvia Plath after one of her suicide attempts, and talk about her brilliant negative in poems at once free and helpless and unjust. Didn't you see how the poet is trying to say, this is how life feels like to me, and my feeling of life like this to me, actually, I can feel this so clearly and vividly. You feel like that too. It can recommend our common humanity against and above the divisions of race or time or history or circumstance or gender. It can reach across those divisions and unify us back in our humanity. That's what I think poetry can do. So let's leave it there for today. And I hope you've enjoyed, at scratching the surface at least, of 3 wonderful, wonderful poems.